Good afternoon, students. I hope you had a nice weekend. Today is Monday, 18 April 2022. Today will be our second of three lectures on the essay by Gerald Dworkin entitled Paternalism, an essay that's now 50 years old but still relevant. Today I'd like to cover pages 4 and 5 of my lecture notes, so I hope you have them in front of you. If so, you can follow along. Let me begin with some general points before we delve into Dworkin's essay. One of the great questions that philosophers of law and even political philosophers have asked is what, if anything, justifies coercion by the state, that is, by government? And this is often called the problem of the moral limits of the criminal law. The criminal law, as you know, consists of a series of threats. The criminal law most of the time says don't do X or else. For example, don't murder anyone or else. And the or else means or you'll be punished. Don't rape or rob or steal or commit arson or kidnap and many other criminal offenses. So that's a threat. The criminal law is threatening people with harm if they perform certain types of action. The criminal law is coercive. Sometimes the criminal law tells you to do something rather than not to do something. For example, you must pay your taxes. In fact, I think today is the final day for filing your tax return. It typically was on the 15th of April, but I think it's been moved to today for some reason. At any rate, sometimes the law says do X or else. Pay your taxes. If you're required to do military service in time of war, the law tells you you must show up for basic training and do what you're told. So coercion is a problem, a philosophical problem. It requires justification. Now, one of my teachers, Joel Feinberg, wrote a 4-volume work entitled The Moral Limits of the Criminal Law. And in that 4-volume work, published in the 1980s, he tried to sort out which cases of coercion by the government are justified and which are not. So if you look at the diagram I have on page 4 of my lecture notes, you'll see some of the principles that Feinberg discusses in those 4 volumes. Let's first focus on the diagram that I have there, and I want to make sure you understand the layout. On the left side of the diagram, which is the column on the far left, you'll see a distinction between using legal coercion to prevent harm to either oneself or to others. And underneath, you'll see the use of legal coercion to benefit either oneself or others. So the distinction is between, say, the law saying don't do X or else, and the law saying do X or else. Okay, it's a familiar distinction. Now, across the top of the diagram, you'll see that I have the words self and others. So it's a 2x2 box diagram, and that means there are 4 individual cells. Let's go through them one at a time. Look at the cell in the northwest, which means the upper left. When you read the leftmost column and the column in the header at the top, you get this. The use of legal coercion to prevent, eliminate, or reduce harm to self. Sometimes the law forbids you to do things, and if you were to ask for the justification, the answer would be, it's for your own good. Sometimes the law prevents us from doing things for our own good. And you'll see that in that box, I wrote the following, and these are from Feinberg. Number 1 is what Feinberg calls legal paternalism. And down below, number 2, you'll see what Feinberg calls moralistic legal paternalism. There are two ways we can harm ourselves. One is by harming our body, our psyche, or perhaps our purse. By purse, I mean property. So sometimes the law says you can't do this because it will be harmful to yourself. Either it harms your body or it is costly to you in terms of property or money, or in some way it harms your psyche, which is your state of mind. So let's call that legal paternalism. That's what Feinberg calls it. But there are other ways to harm yourself. One way to harm yourself is to harm your own character. Notice that has nothing to do with your purse or your psyche or your body. It's harm to your character, your moral character. Now, this is probably a pretty rare example, but Feinberg puts it in just to be thorough. Okay, let's turn to the northeast quadrant of this chart. This would be using legal coercion to prevent people from harming others, not themselves, but other people. This is called the harm principle. So if the law prohibits and punishes murder, which it does, the rationale for that would be to prevent people from harming others, not themselves, but other people. Most of the crimes fall into this category. Laws against murder, robbery, rape, kidnapping, arson, assault, battery, and that sort of thing. All of them can easily be justified on grounds that the act itself harms people other than the person performing the act. Now let's turn to the lower left, the southwest quadrant. Now we're using legal coercion to force or coerce people into doing something, not abstaining from doing something or refraining from doing something, but actually doing something. In the first example, in the lower left, would be forcing people to do things for their own good. And here, again, you'll see two numerals, 1 and 2. Numeral 1 is what Feinberg calls benefit conferring legal paternalism. This is where the government forces you to do something that on the ground that it's good for you. It would benefit you in some way, financially or in terms of helping you live longer and be more productive, healthier, that sort of thing. Number 2 is moralistic benefit conferring legal paternalism. Again, this is probably rarer than the number 1. This would occur where the government forced you to do something or coerced you into doing something for your own good, not your bodily good or your financial good or even your psychic good, but your moral good. It's an attempt by the law to improve people's moral character. It's an attempt by the law to perfect people's moral character, to make them better people morally. Now, there may not be many examples of that, but there could be, and if there were, this is the category in which Feinberg would place them. Attempts by the law to make us better people. Okay, the final box is on the lower right. It's the southeast quadrant. Here, the law is requiring that you do something not for your good, but for the good of others. Feinberg calls this the benefit to others principle. For example, what if the law required that you contribute a certain amount of money to charitable organizations? The law could require that for the sake of the people who will benefit from that. And that would fall under numeral 1, benefit to others principle. The law might also require, and this is number 2, that we do things for the moral benefit of others, to help improve other people's moral character. And Feinberg calls this the moralistic benefit to others principle. So notice there are 4 different possibilities. The law can coerce people into not doing something for their own good. It can coerce people into not doing something for the good of others. It can coerce people into doing something for their own good. And it can coerce people into doing something for the good of others. Now, Feinberg doesn't think that all of these are justifiable. Feinberg says that the harm principle clearly is justifiable. It's always a good reason, he says, to coerce people that the proposed action would harm others. He calls that the harm principle. Feinberg is leery of legal paternalism. Like many philosophers, Feinberg says that the law may never or seldom ever coerce people for their own good. Feinberg is what's called a liberal. He believes people should be free to act as long as they're not harming others. They should be free to make mistakes. They should be free to do stupid things and presumably learn from their mistakes over time. So Feinberg exalts the individual. He does not want government treating competent adults as though they were children. Adults get to make their own decisions. And if the harm that they produce falls only on themselves, so be it, Feinberg says. The government has no business restricting people's liberty for their own good. For the good of others, yes, that's the harm principle. Now, I posted on Canvas a 2-page handout. I copied mine on both sheets, both sides of the same sheet of paper. This is from one of Feinberg's books. This is from volume 4 of that 4-volume set. And Feinberg has a section early in the book entitled Definitions of Liberty-Limiting Principles. And if you read through it here and on the backside, you'll see that Feinberg has 10 different principles, and 7 of them are on my diagram that I just went over with you on page 4 of my lecture notes. So read that over carefully. It has the harm principle, something Feinberg calls the offense principle, which is not on my chart. He then marks out what he calls the liberal position, and that's the position that he ends up taking. Feinberg is a well-known, or was, a well-known liberal on the question of the moral limits of the criminal law. There are people who think that legal paternalism is sometimes justified. Feinberg was not one of them. Okay, so let's move on and let's get to the article by Gerald Dworkin entitled Paternalism. Now, the reason I just went over the diagram on my page 4 is to help provide some background for you. Gerald Dworkin is concerned in this essay solely with one of the liberty-limiting principles, and that is what Feinberg calls legal paternalism. Okay? So, having given you a diagram showing many possible principles, we're now going to zoom in on one of them, legal paternalism, and we're going to see whether Dworkin supports coercing people for their own good or opposes it. Now, he may not take an extreme position. It's always possible to take a moderate position on a question like this. You can reject both of the extremes. You can say, for example, that sometimes it's justifiable to coerce people for their own good. Sometimes. But sometimes it's not permissible or justifiable to coerce people for their own good. Now, if you take that position, you have to state a principle that will help us distinguish between those cases of legal paternalism that are justifiable and those that are not. And I think that's what Dworkin is trying to do in this article. By the time we reach the end of this article, you will start to see where he draws the line between justifiable and non-justifiable or unjustifiable acts of paternalism. But first we need to back up. We need to see how Dworkin defines paternalism. How does he understand the concept? How does he analyze the concept? So let's begin with a famous quotation from a philosopher of the 19th century. You may have heard of him. I'm pretty sure I mentioned him somewhere along the line in this course already. The philosopher I have in mind is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill. In 1859, Mill published a book which is still quite famous, entitled On Liberty. It's about liberty, about individual liberty. It's about the value of individual liberty, and Mill does think it's significantly valuable. And it's about whether individual liberty may ever be interfered with or limited by the state, or maybe by society generally, not acting through the mechanism of the criminal law at all. So here's what Mill wrote in that book. By the way, I should mention, Mill says in the preface to the book that it was co-authored by his wife, Harriet. Harriet Taylor was her maiden name, and I'm not sure whether she ever took Mill's name and became known as Harriet Taylor Mill. But Mill gives her credit for helping him to write the book. Unfortunately, her name does not appear alongside his on the title page. But I think, given what Mill said, that we should acknowledge her as the co-author, or certainly as someone who assisted him greatly in the writing of this book. Now, Mill, I'm going to skip over the two quotations at the top of the article. They're called epigraphs. And I'm going to get right to Mill's famous quotation. Here's what Dworkin says. Now, I'm going to just read this whole paragraph. Dworkin says, I take as my starting point the, quote, one very simple principle, unquote, proclaimed by Mill in his book on liberty. And here's a quotation from Mill, from that book. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The sole end, meaning the only possible justification for limiting individual liberty, is to protect people from others, from the person who's being limited. He goes on to say that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Okay, so that's the harm principle, isn't it? Mill is, up until now, stating the harm principle. He's saying, in effect, that it's always a good reason to limit people's liberty, that if we did not, they would harm others by murdering them or stealing from them. Now here comes what Dworkin considers a second principle. Mill says he cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right, unquote. So let me put the article down. What is Dworkin saying? He's first of all quoting Mill, these famous words from Mill, and he's going to go on and comment on them. The first thing he says about this is that although Mill called this one principle, it's not just one, it's two. It's opposition to coercing people for their own good, and it's support for coercing people for the good of others. So Dworkin thinks that it's really two different principles. And if it's two principles, then it's conceivable that one of those principles is justified and the other one is not. Mill, for some reason, collapsed them into one principle. Mill also called it a simple principle, and Dworkin takes issue with that as well. Dworkin says it's not simple, it's complicated. Right? There's a structure to it. Right? It's not just one simple principle, it's two complicated principles that need a lot more discussion and defense. So that's how Dworkin begins his essay, by quoting from Mill. He then points out immediately in the second paragraph that his concern in this article will be paternalism, not the harm principle. Dworkin is concerned with the principle that it is wrong to coerce people for their own good. And he says that's the second of the two principles that Mill has identified. So let's set the harm principle aside. If we come back to it at all in our discussion, it'll be just to distinguish the harm principle from legal paternalism. So I'm not saying we won't mention it again today or later this week, but it won't be our main focus. We're going to focus now on paternalism. And you can see the title of Dworkin's essay. It's that word, paternalism. Now, what Dworkin is going to do before he gets to the question of whether paternalism is ever justified, he wants to make sure that his readers understand exactly what it is he's talking about. What is paternalism? It may be that there are different types, and he thinks there are. He's going to go on to distinguish between what he calls pure paternalism and impure paternalism. And he's also going to say that just because a particular law can be justified on paternalistic grounds doesn't mean that it can't also be justified on grounds of, say, the harm principle. There can be more than one justification for the same law. Now, we might call that, and you look at the heading of my lecture notes, I call it justificatory over-determination. You might even call it over-justification. And what I mean by that is that a particular law could be justified not only on the grounds that it prevents harm to the person performing the act, but it prevents harm to other people besides the person performing the act. So there would be two separate and distinct justifications for the very same law. And I assume that if there are two justifications for a law, that would be a more powerful case for that law than if there were just one justification. Other things being equal, two justifications makes a stronger case than just one. So here are some examples of a law that has more than one justification. I have in my notes suicide. Imagine that there's a law that prohibits and punishes people who commit suicide. Now, you're probably snickering at this point. You're probably saying to yourself, how can you punish someone who's committed suicide? The person is no longer even alive. You can't inflict corporal punishment on someone who's dead. You can't inflict capital punishment on someone who's already dead. It seems you can't confine in a prison someone who's dead. So what sense can be made of the idea of punishing someone who is dead? Well, believe it or not, my first published article back in 1982 was about precisely this question. The title was The Legal Status of Suicide in Early America, a comparison with the English experience. And what I showed is that there were various ways to punish people who committed suicide. For example, even though if you commit suicide, are no longer around to be punished by having your property taken from you, the law can forfeit your property to the state and prevent your family from getting your property. Right? Now, most people care about such things. Most people would say, if I kill myself, my family will be deprived of all of my property. And I care about my family. I don't want my family to be deprived of my property. So I'd better not kill myself. So a law that prohibits suicide might well have a deterrent effect. It might keep the number of suicides down. Now, some people might kill themselves even though they know full well that their family will not inherit money. And that may alarm them or trouble them, but they may do it anyway. But some percentage of people who want to kill themselves will be deterred from doing so because they don't want their family to be deprived of their property. So the English law, this won't surprise you, the English law punished suicide by forfeiting the suicide's property to the state and preventing the family from taking the property. Other punishments for suicide were things like depriving or denying people a burial, a Christian burial. Now, you may think, well, that's no big deal, but if the person who committed suicide was religious, he or she may have wanted a Christian burial. And maybe because the person thinks that a proper Christian burial will be connected to happiness in the afterlife, or maybe earning God's good graces. At any rate, many people would be disturbed in knowing that they could not be given a Christian burial. And if the law announced publicly, anyone who commits suicide will be denied a Christian burial, that might have a deterrent effect on some people who would otherwise kill themselves. Some people who committed suicide were buried at a crossroad with a stake driven through their heart. Seriously, this was one of the forms of punishment. Now, many people, some people at least, would say, I don't want that. That's humiliating, disgraceful, that will stain the name of my family. My family will suffer as a result of this act of mine, so I'm not going to kill myself. So the law, in its genius, figured out ways to deter people from committing suicide. In other words, the law figured out ways to punish people who killed themselves. Okay, now let's go back to the point. Suppose the law prohibits and punishes suicide, i.e., killing oneself. What could be the possible justification for that? Well, the first justification for that is that if you kill yourself, you would be harming people other than yourself. Your family, for example, in a jurisdiction that has a forfeiture provision, you would be depriving your family, including your children, of the means to support themselves. You may be causing your family to suffer, maybe even to starve to death if they can't find a way to support themselves. So in order to prevent harm to other people, the law restricts your liberty. It tells you you can't kill yourself. So notice the harm principle would come into play to justify the prohibition on suicide. Number two, the law might say that you can't kill yourself in public. It might be more specific. And the rationale for that would be if anybody observes your suicide, they may be offended by it. They may suffer trauma watching you jump in front of a train or jump off a building or shoot yourself in the head or whatever. And that's not to prevent other people from being harmed by your killing of yourself. It's to prevent other people from being offended or suffering psychic disturbances, right? Unpleasant mental states, if you will. Third, in prohibiting and punishing suicide, the law will be preventing harm to you, the person who is thinking of killing yourself. So if the law deters you from killing yourself, the law will have succeeded in preventing you from harming yourself. And that's harm to self, not harm to others, but harm to self. And finally, here's a principle that is not on my chart on page 4, but it's on here on this list. It's called legal moralism. The law might prohibit and punish certain acts on the ground, not that they're harmful to anyone, but on the ground that they're inherently immoral. The act itself is wrong, therefore the law prohibits it. This is called legal moralism. You might think of it as legislating morality. Right? The act is considered wrong, and the legislature therefore bans it and punishes it if it's committed. Now, arguably, it's wrong to kill yourself, morally speaking, and so if the law punished suicide in any of the ways I mentioned, the law is simply enforcing morality. The law is upholding morality, if you will. So, notice what I am and am not saying right now. What I am saying is that there could be more than one justification for a particular criminal prohibition. I've just given an example involving suicide where you could make a case that 4 different principles apply. The harm principle, the principle called legal paternalism, the principle called offense to others, or the offense principle, and a principle called legal moralism. 4 different principles listed by Feinberg arguably come into play for this one criminal prohibition. I'm not saying Feinberg thinks that all 4 principles are valid, because he doesn't. He thinks the harm principle is valid and the offense principle. But Feinberg rejects legal moralism and legal paternalism. Okay? Other people think that legal paternalism is justified. Feinberg does not. Some people think that legal moralism is justified. Feinberg does not. Now, if you want to know why, all I can say is you need to read Feinberg's books. Feinberg has 4 books, as I told you earlier. In volume 1, which is entitled Harm to Others, he addresses the harm principle, and he defends it. He supports that principle in that book. In volume 2, the title is Offense to Others. And Feinberg, in that book, supports or defends what he calls the offense principle. In volume 3, which is entitled Harm to Self, Feinberg discusses and rejects legal paternalism. In volume 4, and it's from that volume where I take this handout, in volume 4, the title is Harmless Wrongdoing. And this is where Feinberg discusses legal moralism, and it's also where he rejects that principle. So the first 2 volumes, Feinberg supports a principle. In the other 2 volumes, he rejects a principle. Okay? So let's continue our discussion of Dworkin on paternalism. On page 4, I write the following. Suppose the stated rationale for a given law is paternalistic. In other words, suppose that when the law was enacted, the legislators said during their debate, or maybe in the preamble of the law, the legislators state openly that the rationale for the law is to prevent people from harming themselves. What we have there is an explicit justification that we would call legal paternalism. Okay? Now, suppose that the stated justification is legal paternalism, but in fact, we have rejected legal paternalism, like Feinberg does. Does that mean that the law is therefore unjustified? No, because for all we know, there could be an alternative justification for that law. The harm principle, for example, might be brought into play. So just because one justification for a given law fails doesn't mean that there's no other adequate justification for the law. And that's typically the case. There often can be more than one justification for the very same act. If you think back to 2003, some of you I know were just children then. Maybe some of you weren't even born then, but I remember it vividly. In 2003, the United States invaded a sovereign country known as Iraq. Now, many people wondered whether that invasion was justified, morally speaking. So whether it was justified depends on whether there's any adequate justification of it. And what I'm now suggesting is that there might well have been more than one adequate justification. One justification, for example, might have been to find and destroy weapons of mass destruction. It was widely believed at the time of the invasion that the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had in his possession, ready for use, weapons of mass destruction, maybe even nuclear weapons. And so the thought was that since his regime was unstable, it would be best if someone invaded and confiscated those dangerous weapons so that he couldn't use them. So that's one possible justification for the invasion. There may have been others. It may have been that Saddam Hussein was a war criminal for things that he had already done to his own people or to others, such as Iranians. And it may have been argued that invading and capturing him would be to do justice, to put him on trial in the International Criminal Court for his war crimes or his crimes against humanity. And there might even have been other justifications. So my point is this: a given act can have more than one justification. And even if one of those justifications fails, it's possible that another one succeeds. Okay? So always look for all the justifications for the particular act. Only if all of the justifications fail would you say, or should you say, that the act itself is wrong. Nothing justifies it. Okay, I'm going to skip over the next bullet point. I won't test you on it, but it's in my notes in case I wanted to discuss it. I think I'll skip over it right now because we have a lot to cover. Let's turn to the next section of my lecture notes at the bottom of page 4. The next thing Dworkin does, and his goal is to make sure that his reader understands what he's up to in this article, what he's talking about. He gives lists of acts that he considers paternalistic. I call them exemplary paternalistic interferences. So let's take a look at his pages 65 and 66. Okay? Let's begin with Dworkin's preliminary definition of paternalism. Here's what he says at the top of that page 65. He says, by paternalism, in other words, by my use of that word, paternalism, I shall understand roughly, and the word roughly is important because later in the article he's going to refine it and make it more subtle. So he starts off with a rough definition, just to give the reader an idea of what it is. And that means later he may qualify it or restrict it or modify it in some way. Okay, here it is. Paternalism, roughly speaking, is the interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reasons referring exclusively to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values of the person being coerced. Period. Now, it's not that long of a definition. Let's break it down into its parts. First of all, paternalism is some kind of interference. Now, there are a lot of ways to interfere with things. If there's a baseball game going on and I'm in the stands watching it, I can interfere with the game by throwing something onto the field or jumping onto the field and running around, which sometimes happens. Okay, I'm interfering with the game. I could interfere with somebody's action by shooting and killing that person or knocking him or her down or grabbing and holding someone, right, to keep that person from moving about. So it's some kind of interference with what? With a person's liberty of action. So liberty of action is someone being free to move around and do what he or she pleases. If I interfere, I'm doing something to restrict or confine that person's freedom or liberty to move about, freedom of action. Okay, that's not all, right? Paternalism isn't just interfering with people's liberty. It's done for a particular reason. And that reason is for the good of the person who's being limited or restricted. So suppose I walk up to someone Suppose someone is looking at his or her phone while walking down the street. And I, who happen to be standing there observing this, I notice that the person is walking directly toward a depression in the sidewalk. Maybe it's a construction zone, right? And if the person steps into that depression without knowing it, that person could very well sprain an ankle, or worse, fall down and hit his or her head on the pavement. So I may run up, realizing that time is short, I may run up and grab that person and hold him or her and keep that person from moving forward. Or I may just go up and push the person out of the way of the depression in the sidewalk. It could be different things. I could do different things. Notice, I have interfered with the liberty of action of some other person. Now, what if that person says to me, "Hey, what are you doing?" The first thing I'll say is, "Excuse me, you were walking toward a hole in the sidewalk. See it right there? And it seemed to me that you weren't paying attention and that you were heading right toward it. So I took the liberty of interfering with you, and it was for your own good." That would be the main point, right? I didn't do it as a joke. I didn't do it to prevent you from harming other people. I might well have done it if you were going to harm someone else, but that wasn't the reason. My reason for limiting your liberty on this occasion was to prevent you from harming yourself. Okay, that's paternalism, according to Dworkin. So the paternalizer is always restricting someone else's liberty for his or her own good, the way a parent limits the liberty of his or her children for their own good. And it may be that paternalism of one's children is perfectly appropriate, can easily be justified. But that's not true when you're limiting the liberty of a competent adult. Right? That's a different matter. Right? Adults are not children. So when you paternalize an adult, you must justify it. We can think of that as the presumption against paternalism. Right? Remember, presumptions are rebuttable. The presumption of innocence in a criminal court can be, and sometimes is, rebutted by the prosecutor. The prosecutor puts so much evidence on the scale that it outweighs the other side of the scale, even with the presumption of innocence on that side of the scale. So if you think of it as a scale, let my hands be the platters. Before the trial even starts, one side of the scale is weighted down, right? This one right here, see this one? It's got the presumption of innocence on it already. The prosecutor has to rebut that presumption by putting enough evidence on this side of the scale to outweigh it. And very often the prosecutor does manage to do that, as you know. Guilty verdicts are quite often rendered in criminal courts in this country. Sometimes the prosecutor fails to carry that heavy burden. So the trial starts out like this. The prosecutor puts evidence on this side, but in the opinion of the jury, it's not enough to outweigh the presumption of innocence. So the jury in a case like that would render a verdict of not guilty, and the defendant would go free. Charges would be dismissed. Okay, so presumptions by their nature can be rebutted. I think what Dworkin is going to suggest in this article, I know, is that there should be a presumption, or there is a presumption, against paternalizing competent adults. In other words, anyone who wants to paternalize an adult has a burden to carry, a burden to bear, a presumption to rebut. And you have to make a case for why paternalism is justified in this situation, or in a situation like this one. Okay, now I said we would be looking at some examples. Let us take a look at Dworkin's examples from page 65. He says, the following is a list of the kinds of interferences I have in mind as being paternalistic. So as we go through this list, look for the following. Who's limiting whose liberty, and try to find the justification. Look for the good of the person whose liberty is being restricted. Try to identify the good that's being invoked by the paternalizing party. Okay, number one, laws requiring motorcyclists to wear safety helmets when operating their machines. So here we have the paternalizer is the law or the government, and the law is saying to people who want to ride motorcycles, wear a helmet or else. The law is requiring that a particular act be performed, namely the wearing of a helmet, and if a helmet is not worn, the law will apprehend and punish you. So the law is threatening people with harm in the form of punishment if they refrain from acting in a certain way. Now, all this shows is that one possible justification for helmet laws, safety helmets, is paternalism. There may well be other justifications. Maybe people who don't wear helmets are risking harm to others if they choose not to wear helmets. We're not going to discuss that right now. It may come up later. All Dworkin is saying is this is an example where there arguably is a paternalistic justification. And the people who enacted the law probably saw it as a paternalistic law. They probably saw themselves as restricting people's liberty for their own good. Motorcyclists should wear helmets. It's in their interest to wear helmets. Many of them don't, so we're going to give them a self-interested reason to wear a helmet. And that self-interested reason is we're going to make it costly for them not to wear a helmet. Why would it be costly not to wear a helmet? Because you run the risk of being prosecuted and punished for not doing so. Number two, imagine a law that forbids persons from swimming at a public beach when lifeguards are not on duty. Now, there may be a period of time each day where a lifeguard is on duty, but also a period of time where there's no lifeguard on duty. And there may be signs that say, swimming allowed only when a lifeguard is on duty, which means that if you go swimming in that place when there's no lifeguard on duty, you could be arrested and tried, and if convicted, punished for it. Now, that law is quite clearly done for the good of the prospective swimmers. It's not safe to be swimming in an area where there is usually a lifeguard present to rescue people who are drowning or at risk of drowning. So this law could be justified as a paternalistic measure to protect people from their own folly, from their own rash decisions, from their own stupidity or ignorance. Number three, laws making suicide a criminal offense. We've already talked about those. Number four, laws making it illegal for women and children to work at certain types of jobs. So the idea here, if this is a paternalistic law, is that it's not in the interest of women and children to perform certain types of labor or to work more than a certain number of hours. And that could be justified theoretically as a paternalistic measure. It's for the good of the women and children. Now, that may be somewhat of a sexist example. Keep in mind that this article was written 50 years ago, and much has changed, as you know, or should know, in 50 years. Attitudes toward men and women what they're capable of, what kinds of jobs are appropriate for them, and so on. Those kinds of things do change, and I think have changed over time. So maybe if Dworkin were to write this article today, he might use only children as his example. He might leave the women part out. Okay, number 5, laws regulating certain kinds of sexual conduct. For example, homosexuality among consenting adults in private. Now, I frankly am puzzled by this example. In order for this to count as paternalistic, the homosexual acts being performed must be dangerous or risky to the participants in some way, and I can't imagine what that is. Is Dworkin implying that there's a risk of disease transmission in having homosexual sexual intercourse? I can tell you that there were many laws on the books at the time prohibiting homosexual intercourse, but Dworkin is suggesting that those laws themselves are justified on paternalistic grounds. So I honestly don't know what the harm is here. Dworkin must think that homosexual sex is harmful to the participants in some way I'm unaware of. And if the law prohibits that kind of sex, then the law must be doing so for the sake of the participants in that sex act. So if you were present in class, maybe you could tell me your thoughts. If you think I'm missing something or know what I'm missing, send me an email. That would be useful. Number 6, laws regulating the use of certain drugs which may have harmful consequences to the user but do not lead to antisocial conduct. So a law that prohibits the use of powerful, dangerous drugs like heroin or LSD or methamphetamines. That law could be justified on paternalistic grounds. It's not safe. Those drugs aren't safe for people. People could have adverse reactions to their use. Okay, a couple more. Laws requiring a license to engage in certain professions, with those not receiving a license subject to fine or jail sentence if they do engage in the practice. So what is Dworkin suggesting here? You can see I have a question mark in the margin at that point. Again, I'm a little bit puzzled as to why Dworkin thinks this would be a paternalistic measure. So the law is telling people you can't engage in this profession without a license. I gather, my best guess is that he's saying that the purpose of this law is to protect people from going to these unlicensed professionals who may make things worse for them. If people are unlicensed, attorneys, cosmetologists, or accountants, whomever, they may make things worse for their clients. So when the law prohibits people like that from practicing, the law is doing so to prevent people, the clients, from going to them, even if they think it's safe. The law is saying, no, even if you want to go to an unlicensed accountant, we're not going to let you because it's not in your interest to do so. And you could complain and say, wait a minute, I'm an adult and I believe this person is competent and I'm getting a good price for the services. I'm willing to pay the price. I know the risks. How dare you tell me I can't use those services? I think that's probably what Dworkin has in mind here. We're limiting the liberty not only of the practitioner, the accountant, but of those who are willing to go contract with the accountant for services. So both parties are having their liberty limited. Only one of them is benefiting from it, and that is the prospective client. We'll say more about this example in a few minutes, because this is an example, I think, of what Dworkin calls impure paternalism. Okay, one more. Number 9, laws forbidding various forms of gambling. So gambling could be, a prohibition on gambling could be justified on the ground that it's harmful to the person engaging in the gambling, right? It's not in your interest to risk money that you've earned and that could be used to pay your bills and provide food and so on. So a law against gambling could have a paternalistic rationale or justification. Notice it could also have a justification in terms of the harm principle. Most people who gamble, I suspect, have dependents, such as children. If you gamble away your wealth, you are harming not only yourself, but other people who depend on you for their well-being. And if you blow all your money in gambling, your children may have to go on welfare. And that harms the taxpayers who have to pay greater taxes to provide for your dependents for whom you should be responsible, not the taxpayers. Okay, one more example, number 11, laws against dueling. Dueling was at one time an institution in the Deep South. If you believed you were insulted or your family insulted, you might challenge the insulter to a duel. And so there came a point when dueling was outlawed. Dueling was made a criminal offense. And one possible justification for that is to prevent people from harming themselves. Many people who challenged others to a duel found themselves killed or gravely injured in the duel. And that's certainly not in their interest. So a prohibition on dueling could be justified on grounds of the harm principle because it involves harming others, but also you may get shot in the duel and suffer harm yourself. So there's a twofold rationale for a given law that prohibits dueling. Okay, now Dworkin goes on to say that not all paternalistic measures are in the form of criminal laws. We've been talking mainly about criminal laws, a criminal law against killing yourself, for example, or a criminal law against dueling. But sometimes the law restricts people's liberty not by threatening criminal punishment, but by regulating their behavior and doing other things that the government does. The government does a lot of things to limit our liberty other than prohibiting and punishing it. So here are some examples. The law might regulate the kinds of contracts that people can enter into. Now, here's a possible contract. It may shock you when I say this, but imagine someone who's down and out, who is made an offer by someone who is wealthy. The wealthy person may say to the person who's down and out, look, you are in great need. You are struggling to feed yourself every day and to clothe and house yourself. And there's no prospect, little or no prospect, that things are going to improve for you. So I'll tell you what, let's enter into an agreement, a contract, a legally binding contract, whereby I will take care of you. I will provide food, shelter, clothing, housing, fuel. All of your basic needs will be provided by me. In return, you will be my slave. You will do whatever I require of you. If I need yard work done, you will do it. If I want you to work in the house, cook and clean, you will do it. If I want sexual services, you will provide them. So you could go on and on with this. The contract is, I will be provided for, but I am submitting to this other person as a slave, a literal slave. I am enslaving myself. Dworkin's first example involves the government ruling out or refusing to enforce this kind of contract. Notice it's not a criminal prohibition. The law would not be saying to the people it's illegal, a punishable offense to enter into this contract. What the law is saying is we, the law, will not enforce any contract that enslaves someone. Even if the person is willing, even if the person is willing to enter into such a contract, even if the person does so voluntarily, knowing exactly what it entails. So here's how Dworkin puts it. Number one, he calls this an example of a law, rule, regulation, or decree which makes it either difficult or impossible for people to carry out their plans. Number one, laws regulating the types of contracts which will be upheld as valid by the courts. And he gives an example that Mill actually discussed. Mill said, no man may make a valid contract for perpetual involuntary servitude or slavery. Perpetual. So this is not just a short-term deal where I agree to work for you for 1 year in return for you providing my basic needs. This is perpetual. It's forever. I agree to be your slave forever in return for you forever providing for my needs. And if the law said the law will not enforce contracts like that, meaning you could get out of the contract anytime you wanted, that would be a paternalistic measure, according to Dworkin. Your liberty to enter into such a binding contract is being limited, and the rationale is for your own good. We're limiting your liberty for your own good. That's paternalism, according to Dworkin. Okay, so look at the rest of those examples on that page. We'll do one more. There are 5 of them. Let's do one more. Number 5, putting fluorides in the community water supply. Now, fluorides are designed to prevent tooth decay, as I understand it. And there came a point where public health authorities said, if we, the government, put fluorides in the city's water supply, it will be to the benefit of everyone, young and old, black and white, male and female. Everyone will benefit. Everyone who consumes the water will have healthier teeth as a result. Notice, the rationale for that is for the good of the citizenry. Notice, choice is being taken away. There may be people who, for whatever reason, don't want fluorides. People who say, wait, I want my water pure and clean. I don't want government putting certain elements into my water. And that's a restriction on my choice or my liberty. I'm no longer free to drink city water without fluorides. If I drink it, it has fluorides in it. So, according to Dworkin, the act of government that requires the fluorides to be put into the city water is paternalistic. It's government limiting the liberty of all the people for their own good so that they have healthier teeth. All right, let's turn to my page 5. Now, we're down to about 10 minutes, so I may not get through all of this, but let's get through at least half of my page 5, and that way we have at least a chance to finish this article on Wednesday when I do my next lecture. Let's talk a little bit about a distinction that Dworkin draws between pure paternalism and impure paternalism. And before we get to it, what's the difference in general between something being pure and something being impure? Well, here's a silly example. Suppose you buy some flour at the store, you bring it home, and you put it into your airtight canister. And when you do that, you can see it's pure flour, right? Maybe you shake it around and look at it. There are no impurities in it. There are no bugs in it, no foreign objects, pieces of metal or wood or plastic or anything like that. So that's pure flour. Now, what if some other substances got into that flour? Like I said, bugs or pieces of metal, plastic, wood. We would say that flour is impure. Right? It's adulterated. It's got some impurities in it. So that's the basic idea. Dworkin thinks that there are cases of pure paternalism, which means there are no other elements, no other possible justifications, and there are what he calls impure cases, where there's some kind of foreign element involved. So let's look at his examples. In pure paternalism, Dworkin says, the person whose liberty is limited is the very one whose good is cited. Okay, so the class of people whose liberty is limited is precisely identical to the class of people who are supposedly the beneficiaries of that. So these two circles converge. They're identical. So we're limiting the liberty. Imagine a circle here. We're limiting the liberty of those people for the good of those very people. That's pure paternalism. Here's an example. Banning cigarettes. Imagine government saying, henceforth, it's a crime to manufacture, sell, buy, transport, or consume cigarettes. Now, we haven't reached that point. Maybe one day there will be such a law, but we can at least imagine it right now. Imagine government banning cigarettes in all of those ways I just mentioned. The people whose liberty is being limited, the purchasers, because they can't get cigarettes anymore, their liberty is being limited for their own good. So banning, I'm sorry, let me back up. I looked at the wrong place in my notes. I just realized I was giving an example of impure paternalism. Okay, when you get done laughing, come back. This is an example of impure paternalism. Pure paternalism, let me begin with that one, is where smoking is banned. Smoking, not the manufacture or sale of cigarettes, but smoking. Suppose the state passed a law and it said, henceforth, it is a punishable offense to smoke a cigarette. Whose liberty is being limited by that law? The answer is prospective smokers, people who want to smoke. Okay, let them be the first circle. Whose good is being cited for that prohibition? That's the second circle. The very people who want to smoke. So here are the two circles. They're identical. That's pure paternalism. Sorry about the confusion. The law is justified by the good of the very people whose liberty is being limited. Excuse me now. Let's go back to a case of impure paternalism. Suppose instead of banning smoking, the government banned the manufacture of cigarettes. Leave aside the sale, the purchase, the transportation. Suppose the government just says, henceforth, it shall be a punishable offense to make cigarettes, to manufacture cigarettes. Now, according to Dworkin, the rationale for that would probably be to benefit people who would otherwise smoke. Right? We're trying to keep them from smoking for their own good. But whose liberty is being limited? It's in the first example above, only the liberty of would-be smokers was limited. Now their liberty is still being limited because they can't find cigarettes. Cigarettes can't be manufactured, so they can't smoke. We're still limiting their liberty, But notice we're also limiting the liberty of anyone who wants to manufacture cigarettes for sale or gift or whatever. So in cases of impure paternalism, the two circles are not identical. They may overlap to some extent, but they're not the same circle. So think of it this way. In cases of impure paternalism, two or more people want to think of them as a group. They want to team up to do something. And the law says, no, you can't do that. If the law says the reason you can't do that is because one of you will be harmed by it, that's paternalistic. The law is telling, suppose the two people teaming up are A and B, and the rationale for the law is to protect the interests of B. Okay? The law is limiting the liberty of both A and B to team up to do what they want to do together. And the rationale for the law is to protect one of those parties, B. So A's liberty is being limited for the sake of B. But notice, B's liberty is also being limited for the sake of B. That's the paternalistic part. So Dworkin says, this is not a case of the harm principle being applied. In the harm principle, we limit the liberty of A to protect B. That's the harm principle. In pure paternalism, we limit the liberty of A to protect A. In impure paternalism, we limit the liberty of both A and B to protect B. You see why that's impure? Because A is having his or her liberty limited, and A is not the person who is supposedly benefiting from that limitation. So I'm trying to help you make sense of Dworkin. I'm sorry, a moment ago I got confused and gave the wrong example, but I hope you now can see the difference between the harm principle, pure legal paternalism, and impure legal paternalism. Let's go back one more point. Earlier today, we discussed the case of the professional, a cosmetologist, for example. Do you know what cosmetology is? I had to look it up. I had a general idea, but I wanted to get the precise definition. Cosmetology is the art and science of beautifying hair, nails, and skin. Okay? Think of cosmetology as the art and science of beautifying parts of the body, such as hair, skin, and nails. And people who engage in this as a livelihood are called cosmetologists. You may or may not know this, but every state requires that cosmetologists be licensed. You can't offer your services, you can't offer cosmetological services to the public unless you are a licensed cosmetologist. Now, is that licensing scheme justifiable? And if so, what is it exactly that justifies it? Can it be justified on the basis of the harm principle, where we're limiting one person's liberty to protect some other person's well-being? Can it be justified on the basis of pure paternalism, where we limit someone's liberty in order to benefit that very person? Or is it a case of impure paternalism, where we're limiting the liberty of two or more people who want to work together as a team, and their working together will have an adverse effect on one of them? In other words, A and B work together, but their act will harm individual B, who's part of the team. Suppose the state requires that cosmetologists be licensed. And if they're not licensed, they will be in trouble. They will be prosecutable under the law. They'll be punished for it. Now, this is a case of impure paternalism in Dworkin's terminology, because here you have the cosmetologist, we'll call that A, who wants to work together with B, a prospective customer. They want to work together the cosmetologist wants to work on B's skin, hair, or nails. B is a willing participant. B is willing to pay for A's services. But the law says, we're not going to let you do that. Why not, says B. Why not, says A. And the law's answer is because it's risking B's life or health. Probably not life, but maybe health. An incompetent cosmetologist could destroy someone's hair or nails, causing serious health problems, or skin. Imagine a cosmetologist who doesn't know what he or she is doing, putting some toxic substance on the skin, and it could cause lesions or pain or some long-term bad effect. So the law says to A and B, I know you want to contract with one another for the services of A, and you're willing to do that, B. I understand that, but it's too risky for you, B, to let A work on you. So we're going to prohibit A from working on you because A is not licensed. If A goes ahead and gets a license, that's fine. Then you can contract with A to get your nails done. But until that happens, we're not going to let you. Well, that seems to me to be a case of impure paternalism, right? Because the liberty of A is being limited, the liberty of B is being limited, but the justification for it is to protect B from A. So two people's liberty is being limited, but only one of them's good is being invoked as justification for it. Okay, I think that's enough. I'm almost through page 5. We have another short section to get to. We need to cover pages 5, 6, and 7 next time. I think it's doable. I might have to be less long-winded as I go. Today's lecture took 1 hour and 17 minutes. I'm about to shut it down. Have a great day. Certainly make sure you've read the entire article by Dworkin carefully before you watch the next lecture, which I'll put up on Wednesday. And I'll get this one put up later today. See you next time.